Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of SPME and the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, ASMIA. And it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series. I'm your host this afternoon, and we will have the opportunity to hear from our friend and colleague, Steve McGuire. Steve directs ACTA's Campus Freedom Initiative, which encourages colleges and universities to adopt policies and practices that support free expression on diversity and thought on campus. He's a prolific writer and scholar on the issues of free speech and academic freedom. Current events, obviously, in the academy and within the environment that all of us have been watching and observing for quite some time, make Steve's work extremely relevant, especially post 10/7. Now that we are into the beginning of 2025, and with the new administration coming in, there's a great deal to discuss, especially on the heels of President Trump's new executive order regarding a lot of the issues we've been following regarding anti-Semitism. So there's a lot to discuss, and Steve's thoughts and insights are going to be greatly appreciated. A few housekeeping issues. Those of us who've been with us in the past know Steve will talk for about 25 minutes to 30 minutes or so. Then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be via the chat, so obviously feel free to type in your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. If we do not, I apologize in advance, and we'll do our best to respond after the webinar. So really, without further ado, Steve, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who's attending. Really delighted to be here. So as Asaf mentioned, I work on academic freedom and free speech issues for the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I've been with ACTA for about, it's getting close to 3 years. Before that, I was a professor at Villanova University. My background is in political theory. As far as my work at ACTA goes, we've been working for, ACTA has been for a number of years, and then since I joined them, we've been working on academic freedom issues, trying to get colleges and universities to improve their policies and practices in ways that will better support a culture of free expression and commitment to diversity of thought on their campuses. So shortly after I joined, we launched what we call our Campus Freedom Initiative. And this is grounded in our gold standard for freedom of expression, which is 20 policies or practices that we think colleges and universities can adopt, as I was saying, to improve the conditions on their campuses. And I can drop that quickly in the chat if people want to take a look at it. You can see what sorts of things we recommend. So we're working on these issues, and then October 7th happens, and the response on American campuses is absolutely shocking. And this becomes not the only focus of our work, but certainly a significant portion of it. And the way that even we at ACTA to some degree see what happened is we saw this explosion of anti-Zionism, explosion of anti-Semitism on campus, and then we see a kind of almost inversion in terms of concerns about freedom of expression, where people who previously were part of the problem, really, in terms of shutting down debate, being intolerant to different kinds of views and that sort of thing. Suddenly they're expressing concerns that free speech, is being violated, or that academic freedom is not being respected on campus. And, a lot of this, the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism that we saw, it was coming from the left. Right. And at the same time, a lot of, like I said, the sort of anti-free speech, anti-academic freedom activity, not solely, obviously, but a lot of it was coming from the left as well. And so I think there's a kind of consistent line of intolerance towards certain kinds of views that we can see, in this activity or among these groups, right? And so you saw things like, for instance, in some of the in the encampments, right, like no Zionists allowed and that sort of thing. So there's a common thread of intolerance. At the same time, while surely there were times when legitimate free speech or legitimate academic freedom was violated, we also were repeatedly seeing claims that things that are not really protected, should be counted as part of free speech, right? So, debates about whether the encampments were peaceful or not, violating rules, disrupting campus, disrupting in some cases even classes, occupying buildings, right? All these different things are taking place, and yet people are just trying to say that their free speech rights are being violated. And then there was that now famous congressional hearing with the three university presidents, and it just, the whole sort of response made it clear that there was a kind of double standard or hypocrisy on American campuses when it came to anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. Claudine Gay, earlier in October, after, I think they released 3 statements, trying to deal with the response to October 7th on their campus. And, they could not, get it right. And, she said in one of them that Harvard was utterly committed to freedom of expression. But of course, they had a history of, allowing scholars to be punished for heterodox views. Their rankings in FIRE's annual campus, free speech surveys, Harvard, needed its own category at the time, abysmal, because they were so bad. And so it was just, beyond belief that they were claiming that they were committed to free expression and using this as a basis to justify everything that was going on their campuses, given their history. So I think, in a way, hypocrisy really became the word of the year on American campuses at that point. We also saw later with the American Association of University Professors, which is an organization, of course, that's historically committed to defending academic freedom. Their Declaration on Academic Freedom is kind of the foundational document that most universities appeal to protect academic freedom. And then last summer, they reversed course and basically say that academic boycotts are okay. And, they don't mention Israel in the decision. They don't mention it in their announcement, but, anybody paying attention knows that the only country really that anybody, currently wants to boycott is Israel. So this is clearly opening a door for faculties to endorse the BDS movement. And that's exactly what's happened, including at Rutgers, where the new president of the AAUP works. And, they have, they pass resolutions and they reference the AAUP's new stance that academic boycotts can sometimes be acceptable. So we've seen this kind of call to arms to defend academic and free speech from people who, for the last many years have been okay to watch other sorts of views, be excluded on campus. And, not just people who sort of, find themselves in conflict with the, with cancel culture or getting called out for a statement that they made, but even the whole, hiring and admissions process, right, where people with certain kinds of views are being excluded during searches, either, not necessarily formally, but informally, where admissions processes at universities are selecting people based on signs of their political activism as opposed to their academic credentials, or at least considering both, as opposed to just looking at academic credentials. And so in terms of ACTA's response, we did a number of things relying on principles that we were already advocating for, through our Campus Freedom Initiative and through, other things that we work on. So at ACTA, we're not just defending academic freedom. That's one of our 3 pillars. The other 2 are academic excellence and accountability. And so, we can really look at this through all 3 lenses and say that, a lot of what we're seeing on our campus is due to a lack of academic excellence. It's about, how courses are being taught, what sorts of courses are being taught, who the faculty are, all of that sort of thing. Through the accountability lens, we can certainly look at, what is the university paying for? What should it be paying for? Where are funds being directed? And then, of course, academic freedom and free speech. And so, in addition to the gold standard that I already dropped in the chat there, I'll just add two other things that we published in the last year. One is our guide for dealing with encampments called An Equal Space for All. And then the other one is a guide that we released on specifically on divestment called Danger in Divestment. And hopefully these links are available for everyone to see. So the encampment guide, we kind of put that together, in the wake of what we were seeing last spring. And ACTA, we work on our name is American Council of Trustees and Alumni. So we'll work with anybody who wants to improve higher ed, but our focus is on working with trustees and alumni. And so these guides, I think, are worthwhile for anyone who's interested to look at. But the primary audience that we had in mind was trustees. What can university trustees do to ensure that they're protecting free expression, but also deal with anti-Semitism on campus and a lot of the disruption and the violations that we were seeing on American campuses in the wake of October 7th, and especially last spring when the encampments really exploded. And so, you can look through that guide and, it's sort of top level advice, and then ACTA is available for anyone who's interested to provide more detail and more concrete recommendations, model board resolutions and policies, all that sort of thing. But our view is that, free expression needs to be protected, but universities and colleges also need to have rules in place to ensure that everyone's rights are respected and that people are able to go about their business on campus, right? People are there because they want to teach, they want to learn, and that needs to be able to happen without being disrupted. So you're certainly free to protest, but you're not free to disrupt a class. You're free to express your views, but you're not free to harass people, discriminate against people, create a hostile environment. And so, all of these documents kind of lay out how we think colleges and universities can navigate that. And of course, another big problem we saw was that even when these institutions had rules on the books for dealing with people who were disrupting the institution, they didn't really enforce those rules. And so that's another thing as well, is the enforcement's a big deal. And so we lay all of that out in there. And then the divestment one. So one of the policies that we recommend at ACTA is institutional neutrality, which you may have heard of. It goes back to the University of Chicago's 1967 Calvin report. Basically, the idea is that the university should not be taking official positions on contemporary social and political controversies. Now, we, along with the University of Chicago leadership and others, including Daniel Diermeyer, the chancellor at Vanderbilt University, we believe that institutional neutrality also rules out divestment, because divestment is really about making a political statement against, usually Israel. And so it would rule out the BDS movement. But, for us, this is part of a package of policies about respecting free speech and diversity of thought on campus. And we think that if universities were really doing that in a serious and even-handed way, and we were to couple that with other reforms, including things like curricular reform, hiring reform, admissions reform, et cetera, that this really would go a long way to fixing a lot of the problems that we see on our campuses, including the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism that we see on our campuses. So left those in the chat. I see Asaf has shared them, so please feel free to take a look. And, always happy to talk if you have more questions. Now, I was asked also to talk about what's currently going on with the Trump administration. And so I want to get into that a little bit. It's still early days. So in some ways, on the one hand, they're kind of flooding the zone with activities. So it's almost like drinking from a fire hose, to, I guess, mix my metaphors. It's very hard to keep up with it all. And at the same time, it's early days. So it's hard to know exactly how it's all going to play out or where it's going to go. But let me say a couple things about what I think they're up to, and then kind of cover some of the main things they've done that affect campuses, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So I think, it's pretty evident that the Trump administration has identified colleges and universities as a problem. I think that, for an organization like ACTA, we're involved in higher ed reform. So we want to see colleges and universities reformed for the sake of making them better. I think there's also, and I'm not saying this is the view of the administration necessarily, but in various, in the rhetoric out there, you see also the idea that the universities are political or ideological enemies of one party or something like that. I think the universities have allowed themselves to get sucked into this. Maybe you've seen the Gallup statistics that only 36% of Americans say that they have confidence in our institutions of higher education, and that percentage is extremely lopsided towards Republicans, although more and more independents and Democrats are also saying that they lack confidence in these institutions. So I think it is a society-wide problem. It's also part of a broader trend of distrust in American institutions. I think that's fair to say as well. But universities really should be institutions that rise above this, and they should be institutions that are helping us as a society to find our way through these problems. And instead, like I said, they've been sucked into it. They're seen as a part of the problem. So I do think for their own sake and for the sake of our country, that our institutions of higher education need to find a way to restore public trust in what they do. And they actually just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Chicago Principles at the University of Chicago, and their president gave a keynote address, and I thought he was quite good on this. He documented several of the instances in recent years, including dealing with the pandemic, but also obviously the response to October 7th, where universities have basically contributed to the destruction of their own, of people's trust in them, and that this really needs to be rebuilt and carefully guarded. So as far as what the Trump administration is doing, insofar as any of it can help to reform institutions of higher education, I think that's a good thing. But we also obviously need to, protect these institutions and ensure that, we're trying to make them better, not just to, undermine them or destroy them. Now, I think the Trump administration, you could look at it in two ways. One is going at the ideological problems on campus, right? The left-wing bias, the lack of freedom of expression, the lack of diversity of thought. And a big part of that gets mentioned a lot is diversity, equity, and inclusion, but then also anti-Semitism on campus. These are things that they explicitly talk about and are explicitly targeting. And so I think there is an overwhelming desire to see some kind of rebalancing on campus, or addressing these issues. And then there's also the financial or the fiscal approach, right, that you get with like Musk and Doge, and they want to, reduce government expenditures and that sort of thing. And my guess is that these two things actually fit together for the Trump administration. We're seeing that, you've seen that in some of the states too, where state governments have tried to go after diversity and equity inclusion, that, it can be difficult to do in a way that's legal and consistent with the Constitution. For instance, the Stop Woke Act in Florida, ran into constitutional problems. But, you have to be very careful that you're not telling people that they can't talk about certain kinds of things, because generally that would be a violation of the First Amendment, certainly on public university campuses. And you can attach these things to, in various ways, to money that goes to private universities as well, although that is a different, obviously a different category, a different situation. But I think it's possible that what the Trump administration is doing, for instance, with the recent NIH cut, right, reducing indirect costs down to 15%, that might just be the people in Doge saying that's that 60-70% indirect cost rate, as some universities have negotiated, is just insane, and we have to cut that in order to save money. That's certainly possible that that's part of the story. It's also possible that part of the story is they're looking for ways to financially punish universities in order to quote unquote persuade them to reform themselves in other ways. Right. There was a group at Columbia. They're called Stand Columbia. They did it's, I think alumni, Friends of Columbia, maybe a few professors. It's an anonymous group. They did an analysis of Columbia's finances and found that the federal government, directly or indirectly, could take away about half of Columbia's annual budget, which even for Columbia, would be devastating, right? People say, dip into your endowment, but endowments, as you may or may not know, are complicated. It's really a whole bunch of different funds. A lot of it is restricted. There's rules about how universities can deal with them. Trustees are responsible for stewarding them. So the idea of just dipping into the endowment to, cover costs, it's not as easy or obvious as it might seem. But anyways, so that might be part of what's going on, and we may continue to see that. Of course, a lot of this is being challenged in court. 22 attorneys general already challenged the cut in indirect costs at the NIH, and that has a judge has ordered a temporary stay on that, so that is currently not being implemented. A bunch of universities and academic organizations have also filed a lawsuit, so that's going to have to be litigated, and other actions that the administration is taking have also been paused and will need to be litigated. As far as some of the other things that they've done that affect universities, so a big one concerns diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. So Trump has issued a couple of executive orders on this topic. One of them is removing it from the federal workforce, from federal agencies. That's going to have some impact on higher ed, because that's going to affect the Department of Education. It's going to affect organizations like the National Science Foundation, the NIH, et cetera. So this is going to remove people from these organizations that work on these issues. The organizations presumably will not be pushing DEI in their programs in the way that they were before. Another one is even more directly affecting higher education, the one called Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. Right, so this one is likely leading to these organizations removing DEI from their grant processes, from their grant programs. This is also the one that has called on the Attorney General to prepare a report that will include basically ideas for up to 9 institutions of higher education that could be investigated for civil rights violations, right? And so that seems to be one way that they're going to try to go after DEI, is looking at basically affirmative action and how it's been practiced in hiring on university colleges and campuses. Some of this, again, we're still waiting to see how it's going to play out. These orders call for the agencies to produce reports. Sometimes it's in 2 months. Sometimes they have up to 4 months to produce a report sort of explaining how they're going to go about this. So assuming the orders legally stand, we kind of have to wait and see how it plays out. And we've seen a lot of that from colleges and universities as well. There's a lot of variation in how they're responding. There also, there's just a lot of silence. You see a lot of messages. If you're on a campus, maybe you've seen one like this, we're aware that this is going on. It's complicated. We're waiting to see how it plays out. Please let us know, if it affects you, that sort of thing. Cornell University, just as an example, they set up a task force. They cited their way of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and said they were setting up a similar task force again, creating a website and even in a separate email address for people to express concerns. Arizona State University's research website was a particularly helpful one early on, showing how some universities were responding to this. They were sort of detailing guidance on the website that they were providing to their university community. And you saw there that for instance, they were saying, just if you're working under a government grant, just stop all spending on DEI basically immediately. Otherwise, continue on. The University of North Carolina system just announced that they were suspending all requirements in either their general education programs or their majors, suspending all requirements that could be counted as DEI. So the courses can still be taught, but they're not going to count as requirements. So that's one of the first ones I've seen that actually sort of moved in the direction of curriculum. And that's where you start to get more concerned about, especially more concerned about issues of academic freedom, because generally professors, have freedom to decide sort of what they're going to teach and how they're going to teach it. Although certainly university administrators and boards of trustees have a role as well in deciding what sorts of programs will be offered and that sort of thing. So that all, usually needs to be negotiated through a kind of process of shared governance. Now, so that's DEI. There's also one on gender identity in Title IX. So this has kind of flipped back and forth in the last few presidential administrations where gender identity and expression is included in Title IX under Democratic administrations, and then it's not included under Republican administrations. So that was an early action right away that the Trump administration removed that from Title IX. Did some other things there, but I'll skip over the details there. Getting to anti-Semitism in particular, as many of you may know, the Trump administration during Trump's first term, he signed an executive order on combating anti-Semitism. That was in 2019. And, I think that was part of the basis that was used for a lot of the Department of Ed investigations and lawsuits that were filed against colleges and universities in the wake of October 7th. And, we've seen some settlements, where basically, without necessarily admitting blame, colleges and universities have settled with the Department of Ed and done things like agreed to set up new procedures or new offices that would ensure against anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism on campus. One of the more striking ones was Harvard recently settled a lawsuit. You may have seen that. And one of the things that they did was adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. They have a bunch of FAQs on their website about this. People debate what impact this has on academic freedom and free speech. Some people express concern about this. Harvard sort of extensively tries to detail or make the case that this will not impact their commitment to free speech or academic freedom on campus, and that it will be used specifically with regard to things like harassment, discrimination, creation of a hostile environment, which are outlawed under Title VI. So Trump has now issued a second executive order on combating anti-Semitism, and this one has kind of like the DEI ones. It's instructed agencies to basically produce reports. I think in this case, in 60 days, detailing what they can do legally to combat anti-Semitism, and it's focused quite heavily on higher education on campuses. It includes instructions to make sure that colleges and universities are aware of rules surrounding eligibility for visas. So this is, there's the possibility here that the federal government will, suggest to colleges and universities, shall we say, that certain people should be deported if they're not, obeying the rules, of their or the terms of their visa status in the United States. So, again, a lot of that we're going to see, like I said, we're going to have to see how it plays out. But it does seem like there's going to be a concerted effort to ensure that colleges and universities actually deal with anti-Semitism on campus in a serious way. So far, we've seen two big actions come out of the government in the wake of this executive order. One is that the Department of Justice has set up a multi-agency task force for investigating anti-Semitism, and they said in the announcement that they're going to focus in particular on college and university campuses. And I just like to note with both the executive order and the creation of this Department of Justice task force, people have expressed concerns that these could have a negative impact or violate free speech rights or academic freedom rights. And certainly, we need to be concerned about that. And if you look at, say, the fact sheet that came out with the executive order, there's certainly some quotes in there from government officials that suggest that mere speech alone is going to be targeted. But I think when you read the executive order and when you read the Department of Justice's announcement of its task force, they focus on actions like harassment, like discrimination. So I want to emphasize that again, right? That the task force is going to be looking for anti-Semitic harassment. And so harassment is illegal, and so that's the basis that they're going to use to go after it. The other thing that we saw was that the Department of Education has launched investigations of 5 universities for anti-Semitism. It was Columbia University, Northwestern, Portland State, Berkeley, and then the University of Minnesota. And so, while we certainly did see investigations under the Biden administration's Department of Education, I think the expectation here is that the investigations under the Trump administration will be much more vigorous, and that they will, be much more exacting in terms of, what demands they make on these universities in order to resolve these situations and ensure that, they're doing enough to protect Jewish and Israeli students on their campuses. And I saw in some of the reports on this, for instance, one of the things they're looking at is protests at commencement or graduation ceremonies and what colleges and universities allowed. I mean, you've probably seen this, where, people either get up and walk out of a commencement, or, they have whatever paraphernalia and signs, and they, display all this during it and even on stage and that sort of thing. So that's an example of the kind of thing that they're going to be looking at. I think in that case, what they'd be looking for is, does this create a hostile environment or contribute to a hostile environment in conjunction with other things that we see on campus? All right, well, I think maybe I'll stop there. I think that's about 30 minutes, and then we can open things up for Q&A.
Great. 1 second. Thank you for that. That was wonderful. Let me just put us all on spotlight here so we can. Yes, as I was saying, thank you for that great comprehensive overview. That's very useful and very important to understand. Obviously the environment that we're navigating here. I got a bunch of questions. I know Alex does as well before we go to the audience. But I'll give Alex the first question to start us off, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks. Well, this is great. I have many questions. Some of the things you were talking about are obviously very familiar to me, and others aren't. I want to sort of back up a little bit, and from the point of view of ACTA, let me ask, what is accountability? What does accountability look like? And more importantly, what are the mechanisms? How and who enforce accountability? I mean, I presume the trustees have a role, but in an age when administrations and shared governance are administrations are the corporation, the corporate functionaries, and the faculty think that they run the show. How does accountability work?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah, I'll say a couple things about that. So one of the things that we always emphasize at ACTA is that boards of trustees or regents, that they have a responsibility for ensuring the overall health and viability and success of the institution as a whole, and that they have a fiduciary duty or fiduciary responsibility, to these things. And so the board really does, boards often, you're asking people who are alumni or donors or who have success in business, they get invited to be on the board of trustees. And a lot of the time what you see is, they're given a stack of documents maybe a week before a meeting, and they're essentially asked to rubber stamp those documents. And then, they come into town for the meeting, and maybe you go to a football game or a basketball game with the president, sit in the president's box or something like that, have some nice dinners. And so, there's it's almost treated as a mostly perfunctory thing, but we emphasize this fiduciary responsibility, and that trustees really do have the authority and the responsibility to take a sort of active role in the governance of these institutions. And so as far as accountability goes, we think that they should be reviewing what the colleges is doing. They should be asking questions, and where appropriate, they should be stepping in to say like, no, we need to fix this. And, that can include things like saying, look, if we're going to have a board of trustees meeting, you have to get us the information sooner, like a month in advance, right? So we have time to look at what you're actually doing and ask questions about it, that sort of thing. Of course, there's things that faculty generally will be given or historically have more authority over. I mentioned, things like curriculum and that sort of thing. But even there, like boards do have a role in deciding what sorts of programs a university is going to offer, what sorts of majors could be offered, that sort of thing. And they can look at this, in terms of the offerings, also in terms of the, financial aspects of the institution, right? So if a program doesn't have that many students going through it and it's not deemed to be essential, to the university or to other programs in the university, then, I think it's fair for trustees to evaluate that situation. I think in an ideal, I'll say one more thing. I think under ideal circumstances, colleges and universities should operate with a great deal of autonomy, and there should be harmony between the various groups on campus, the faculty, the university administrators, the boards of trustees. I think, in present circumstances, what we see a lot of the time is that the faculty can be part of the problem, right? And they don't want reforms. Not all faculty, obviously, but say through the organs of the faculty senate or that sort of thing, right? So I'll give you an example. The University of Michigan in the last year, their regents have passed a number of reforms that we support, right? A new statement on free expression and diversity of thought, a new policy on institutional neutrality. They laid out, new rules governing free expression on their campus to protect people's rights, various other things. And, they've been sort of resisted by the faculty senate and even rebuked by the faculty senate. Another example, at Ohio State University, through the legislature, they've created a new institute for like civics and intellectual diversity, freedom of expression, that sort of thing. And the faculty senate, even though they didn't have the power to stop it, it was already it already is on campus. They voted against it. And I think to me, just politically or pragmatically doesn't look like a great move because, it's not really going to probably affect anything. And it also, just looks bad to be voting against the center that is going to be bringing intellectual diversity and freedom of expression to campus. So, I think boards do have a role there to step in. And then, beyond that, I think legislators do have a role as well. I mean, certainly, like I said, institutional autonomy is probably ideal. Let the people who work at these institutions and run them and are experts at them, be the ones to do that. But if they start to go, too far awry, then somebody needs to step in. And I think we need to recognize that colleges and universities operate within a kind of social contract with the rest of society, right? That they're given things like tax breaks and federal support. And, a lot of the public ones, obviously created by legislatures in many cases in the first place, in order to serve the common good of the country, right? And if people through their elected representatives feel like they're not doing that adequately, then they certainly do have some say, in trying to reform the institution. So I think that accountability can legitimately come through government as well. Although, we do, have to be careful. Legislation is often not as, nuanced maybe as, reform could be if it was conducted, by those on the ground on these institutions.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Or follow-up and a half. Well, you mentioned the Michigan, regions exercising oversight, and at the same time, there was a $250 million DEI initiative that became an autonomous entity within the university, hiring its own faculty and planting them in every single department. And this only this only was curtailed when, of all places, a huge expose appeared in the New York Times,
Yeah.
somewhat, again, unexpectedly. So I guess my follow-up question is, when institutions or units within the institution act as if they have the independent agency, one might say. And I point to two mechanisms or areas in particular. One is admissions, and the other is promotion and tenure. And these are the key uh, routes by which ideological institutions have been ideologically oriented. The kinds of students that you take and the kinds of faculty that you retain. How would you and ACTA suggest? And these are, one is nominally done by faculty themselves, promotion and tenure, and the other is done by nominally by professionals, admissions. So how do you control that if you're a trustee or even a senior administrator?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, it certainly can be difficult to do. We certainly believe that both of those processes, hiring and promotion, et cetera, and then also admissions need significant reform. I think, at the trustee level, you can set policies, you can direct the president and other institutional leaders in terms of the priorities that they set. And you can hold them accountable, right? You can ask them, what criteria are we using to admit students? How are we using those criteria, right? We want to see the data. We want to see the results. And you can make, board resolutions, right? Or establish policies that say, our hiring is going to be based on, the principles of freedom of expression, diversity of thought, et cetera. But I think admissions is arguably the easier nut to crack of those two, because the university, I think you could get into that and say, look, we're going to set certain criteria, we're going to set certain priorities, and then you could monitor that and ensure that the people who are working in that office, are doing things the way that you suggested they ought to be done. When you get into faculty hiring promotion, then you start to get into issues with faculty governance, academic freedom, those sorts of things, right? And so on the one hand, say you're hiring for your political science department, right? You want the members of that political science department to get together and say, well, what we really need is someone who's an expert in, the presidency. And, looking around at what other expertises they have in the room and that sort of thing. And so they would be the ones to then, sort through all of these files and say, well, here are the top 3 scholars applying, to be our presidency professor, and hire that. And that obviously has merit and would be the ideal way for things to operate. But then what you see is, well, everyone has to submit a DEI statement, or there's, implicit discrimination against certain kinds of views, whether it be conservatives or Zionists or what have you, right, among the committee members. And, that can be a bit of a difficult nut to crack. So you need to think of ways to, monitor that. And, there's been different proposals out there, but it is a little bit more difficult to set something up that would ensure fairer, better results, admittedly.
Great.
I'll stop here. I have many more questions. Let's Asaf has, and there are questions from the audience. So
But let me go to the audience. I'll give an opportunity, then we'll come back, depending on time permitting. Our friend and colleague Barbara Tuchel is asking, can you give an example of 1 or 2 institutions that have effective change when it comes to free speech? And what specifically have they done that actually worked? I mean, in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my overall view is that most colleges and universities are not doing a great job on free speech and academic freedom. And my experience working with ACTA so far, at least, is that most institutions, when they run into problems publicly, what they're treating it often more as a public relations crisis than an actually substantive crisis in their institution. One example that comes to mind would be the shout down of Judge Duncan at Stanford Law a couple of years ago, you may remember, and the one DEI dean came in, and I think she thought she was somehow trying to like navigate the situation, but she famously said, to the judge, like about his speech, like, is the juice worth the squeeze? There was a big reaction to that. And the dean of the law school, Jenny Martinez, who's now the provost of the whole university, she put out a long memo on freedom of expression that was quite good in terms of like what she was saying in the paper. And then they committed to doing a series of reforms, but some of that ended up not being nearly as substantive as it seemed like it could be. And it's not clear how serious the change has been. One thing that we've advocated for recently at ACTA, as I mentioned, is institutional neutrality. And a number of institutions, including elite privates like Harvard, have adopted some variation on that in the last year. And, one thing I would note is that, after the presidential election in November, there was not a wave of presidential statements reacting to the election. And again, that's maybe largely a PR move, but I think it's a good thing, and that we shouldn't see these kinds of statements coming out. And if we can establish that as a cultural norm in the academy, I think that would be a good thing. But as far as institutions that we think are doing good things. I mean, I mentioned the University of Michigan. A lot of those actions have taken place in the last year, and obviously they've had some serious problems on their campus and off it, with protests outside their regents' homes and anti-Semitic vandalism at their places of work and that sort of thing. So, to say that it's working well at this point is too early to say, I think. But the reforms that they've implemented there so far are looking quite good. And I think they're, poised to do more. University of North Carolina system is another one that we think has done quite well. They've implemented a number of the reforms that we list on our gold standard for freedom of expression. So those are a couple that I would highlight.
Great, thank you. Our friend and colleague Carrie Nelson, who's here, is asking a question as well. We've seen a number of Department of Education negotiated consent agreements, and they produce little to no results. Do you think there'll be any more enforcement under the Trump administration?
I mean, yeah, I can't say for sure, and I'm not an expert on Title VI enforcement, but that would be my expectation in general. And one thing I might point to in that regard is Harvard's settlement of the lawsuit that I mentioned earlier. In some ways, that was more substantial than some of these other settlements that we've seen of the complaints. And so, you're talking about a lawsuit rather than a complaint, but nevertheless, I would find it hard to believe that when Harvard was settling that lawsuit, they weren't thinking about what the reaction of the Trump administration might be to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on their campus. And I think the Department of Ed launching these 5 new investigations that I mentioned earlier too, I would expect them to have much more rigorous results. Now, exactly what that will be and what it will look like at the end of the day, I can't be sure.
Great, thank you. You touched on Harvard a lot. Let me, going back to a question I had, it's kind of dovetail into the comment that Alex was making before about admissions. There's obviously going to be, a great deal of, we hope, as far as looking at backgrounds of students coming in, especially foreign students that are coming into universities. I mean, where does ACTA stand when it comes to enforcing these issues? I mean, some of the topics that we have addressed and obviously, written, discussed about, the universities operate, it's the kind of the industrial academic complex, and they don't like to say no to money, clearly. Is there a way to reinforce, as far as background checks, as far as, associations with foreign terrorist organizations, where is the reinforcement going to take place here that we can clean up the universities as far as where the environment is being used to turn the institution on its head?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And, I don't know that ACTA has like staked out formal policies on a lot of those kinds of issues. I know that in things that we've published in the past, looking at divestment and BDS and that sort of thing, we've certainly noted some of the funding connections and organizational connections that some of these groups on American campuses have. And I wrote a piece last spring in City Journal. I didn't really trace out like the organizational connections or anything like that, but I looked at this conference that a bunch of these groups held, People's Conference for Palestine or something like that. It was up, in Michigan, and sort of, analyzed a bunch of the rhetoric coming out of that sort of thing. And, it's clear that these are organizations that are using, they don't care about the universities, right? When they complain about their free speech being violated, it's for the most part a propaganda campaign to try and make the universities look bad. What they're ultimately interested in is using the universities in any way that they can to sort of advance the cause of, as they would call it, Palestinian liberation. And they make that, they're quite open, actually, about that. So I do think that, we need to be careful because I think we need to protect free speech, right? We have a First Amendment. We have to adhere to that. And so, people are, up to a certain point, obviously, they're free to organize, they're free to express their views, right? They're free to have funding. If this funding is traced back to terrorist organizations, that's obviously a totally different ballgame at that point. Or if you find that they are in some way involved in material support for terrorism, that's a totally different ballgame. As far as what universities can do, I think the visa enforcement issue is an important one that they need to look at. One example that I found particularly galling personally, I won't speak for ACTA on this issue, but you may recall that I believe this was in November of 2023 that there was a protest at MIT, and they threatened all of the students with suspension if they persisted. They were protesting, I think, inside one of the buildings, and they had said, no, there's areas outside where you can protest, but you can't do that in here because you're disrupting people and that sort of thing. And so they issued these statements threatening them with suspension. And then afterwards, they had to walk it back. Well, they didn't have to walk it back. They chose to walk it back because they realized that a number of the students involved in the protests were international students, and that suspending them would have visa implications for them. Right. And so they suspended them from non-academic activities, but not from academic activities. And, I found this galling because it meant that if these students had been American citizens, their punishment would have been, as far as, what they were free to do at MIT, their punishment would have been more severe than it was. I also think probably MIT, embarrassed themselves there because they didn't sort of think through what they were threatening. And someone brought this up after the fact, maybe the students themselves. But that's an example where you can say, look, we have rules at this institution. You're welcome to be here and express yourself as long as you're respecting the rights of others and playing within the rules. But at the end of the day, if you violate the rules, these are what our policies are, and we're going to apply the punishment. So it becomes an enforcement mechanism at that point, which I mentioned earlier as well. And I'm sure many of the people listening to the webinar have seen this time and again, where universities have just not even enforced the rules that they do have on the books.
A segue to the last point that you made there. I mean, apropos, what happened in MIT, at Columbia, when the encampments were taking place and in the spring semester, what we do know today is that many of those students were actually offered pass-fail grades. So there were no consequences for their actions. I mean, is there a way, through ACTA or through anything that you're looking at where you have this kind of complicit activity between the students and the faculty, where there could be some actually accountability and transparency when they were violating on several fronts, from the faculty side of things and from the student side of things? I mean, is that something that we can expect, or something, effective, tool that you guys are looking at, or that we can be using going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I was aware of these kinds of things for sure. I haven't thought about it as much, but I think this would be an area where, a board of trustees could step in, or maybe even this is something that factors into a Department of Ed investigation. Like if you're talking about the question of a hostile environment, maybe that's something that you take into consideration, right? But certainly, faculty, if you look even at the AAUP's original documents, right, they obviously emphasize academic freedom, but they also emphasize academic responsibility, right? And they say things like, the faculty basically it would be improper for a faculty member to use his or her classroom as a pulpit for indoctrinating students, right? Or exposing them to only the faculty member's ideological point of view, that sort of thing. And, some of these instances, for instance, where faculty have given extra credit for attending an anti-Israel protest or something like that. These are areas where we've seen that university administrations have been able to act, right? Or people have been able to compel them to act, because these kinds of things become violations of the faculty's responsibilities to their students. And so, when you get into things like that, I'm not sure about the pass-fail one, probably similarly could be looked at, where faculty are contributing to these things or compelling students to participate in them, or heavily pressuring them to participate in them. I think that's an area where other authorities, whether it be the board or the university administration or others, should be looking at that and saying, like, yeah, these are lines that you can't cross, and that whether people are disciplined for it after the fact, certainly it should be made clear that these things cannot happen in the future.
Great, thank you. For time constraints, I'm going to give Alex the last question, but and then we'll circle back. But go ahead, Alex.
Well, let me express first a very cynical thought that certainly at Columbia University, you can put cement in the plumbing of a building, and that is regarded as free expression at this point. Moreover, you can be arrested for breaking into a building and then sue the university. So, there's an issue of to what extent academic freedom and free expression have become get out of jail cards with respect to faculty and student relationships at the universities. But my question really is, with universities in crisis, about funding, about a plummeting public reputation, about a demographic cliff that is beginning now and which has begun to force the closure of institutions, where the economics are completely out of whack already before whatever the Trump administration is going to do. Why have a percentage of faculty, 5 to 10, 15% maybe, doubled down? Why have they become absolute adherents or vocal supporters of Palestine in all of its many anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-whatever alleged meanings, primarily anti-Israel? And is this what does that mean for the health of the university as a whole, as an institution, as a concept, and its place in society?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you do make a good point that we have to be careful talking about the faculty. Like, there's obviously variation on the faculty in terms of political views and that sort of thing. The way I generally see it is you've got whatever percentage it is that are, sort of more on the far left. You have a much, much smaller percentage, in some places almost non-existent, of professors who are on the far right. And then you kind of have a big chunk of people in the middle who hold a variety of different political views, and in a lot of cases probably just aren't that politically engaged, right? Like, there's people who are just chemistry professors who want to be left alone to work in their lab, and when stuff comes out of the humanities or whatever that says you have to do X, Y, or Z, they just kind of quickly try to get it done so they get back to their lab or whatever. But I do think we have a deep cultural problem on many of our campuses that is embedded in the faculty, and that there's a large enough contingent, whether it's 10, 15, 20%, on the hard left, who see these institutions as vehicles to advance their political views and their political activism. And you're right, much of what they say and do is protected by academic freedom. And I'll say, like, I think we need to be, very careful to respect free speech, to respect academic freedom. As I was saying at the beginning of my talk, people on the left have violated these things, against people on the right many times over the years. And I think these are important principles and important protections. But I think we do need to, as much as possible, move in the direction of restoring universities as places where people go to research and to teach and to learn, rather than to engage in political activism. I mean, someone asked earlier about an example. I probably should have mentioned the University of Chicago. Not that the University of Chicago doesn't also have problems, but it does make a concerted effort to ensure that people in leadership positions are committed to the Chicago principles. And they do, do a fairly decent job of trying to ensure that those principles, are enforced, so that if a department, for instance, tries to make a statement, they will say, like, no, you have to, it's fine for you as individuals to make that statement, but you cannot make that statement, as a department, or put it up on your website as a departmental position, or something like that. But there is truth to the matter that at the end of the day, part of what we need in order to have cultural reform on our campuses is, to have some personnel reform as well. And like I said, we need to respect academic freedom, but we also need to focus on, bringing in people and bringing in leadership that's committed to the kinds of things that ACTA supports, right? Academic excellence, academic freedom, accountability, all of these things. And I'll say that, I think that free speech principles and academic freedom principles are part of the solution, but those alone are not going to solve the problems of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, general left-wing bias, violations of free expression, even on our campus, because I think there's deeper, more wholesale reforms that need to take place in terms of the missions of these institutions and how the people who run them think about those missions, as well as what the people who work there are doing in terms of their research, their teaching. And so things like curricular reform are also going to be essential. So if your general education core isn't requiring students to learn about American history or American government, but it is requiring people to learn about, say, a DEI course or something like that, where people can bring in their anti-Zionism or their anti-Semitism if they want to, then that's the kind of thing that I think ACTA would point to and say, yeah, there's a problem there. You're not giving people the sort of bedrock that they need through their core education, but you're giving them these other things that are contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing.
Right. Dave, I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Obviously, it's a fluid situation, and we're seeing a lot of problems. And unfortunately, in our space, I guess it's we're cynical. There's a lot to do, and so we are, hopefully we can be successful, and we are here as able and willing partners to your effort to try to make changes, to try to reform these very institutions that we care so much about. So really, I want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank Alex, as always, for joining me, and of course, everybody who joined us this afternoon for taking the time to come and be part of the conversation. Be on the lookout for future webinars. Steve, I hope you can come back and as things become maybe a little bit more clearer coming out of the administrations, and we can continue the conversation and take it from there. So I wish everybody a good day, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you.